All right, let's get started. Yep. Okay. So this is our first symposium today, Symposium 1. There will be 3 speakers, not 4. Dan Weary had to stay home. So the 3 talks have been divided between Victoria Braithwaite, is that how you pronounce your name? David Edelman and Paula Droog, chaired by Adam Shriver. So before we start the symposium, I'd just like to make a few comments about what's happening in the rest of the day, and also a few additional comments while people filter in. It seemed like the sausage sizzle experiment was successful. I wasn't sure if it would be something that people would want in the same quantities tomorrow. Is that, tomorrow there'll be 100 free lunches for the early career research panel, but we probably will have the sausage sizzle again. There's other restaurants at UQ, right? So there's student areas, there's a pizza cafe, there's Wordy's, there's a couple places, but we will still have that sausage sizzle tomorrow. Something else I'd like to point out is, you'll be surprised, all the talks are actually being filmed. But hang on, so brace your, don't get too worried about it. You'll have to sign a consent form, right, to release them, right? So, only I can find them at this point. I won't release them until you sign that form. So, what would be good is if all the speakers, from the keynotes to the symposia to the concurrent sessions, just go to the reception desk and announce yourself as a speaker. And Kathy there will give you a form to sign if you're happy to just have that be available on the web. And that's a pretty good thing, right? So when we go to the concurrent sessions, it's confusing. You stay in one, you miss another. There's one that you would have wanted to see. You can see them all potentially online, linked to the ASSC website. They're all filmed. So also after this session, after the symposium session, there'll be pizza, maybe a bit more than last night. There'll also be some beer. And you'll have pretty much 1 hour to consume it in. And it'll be just enough to satisfy you, to get you to the songlines talk this evening, which is about Aboriginal songlines. So stay for that. And after that, there's a student social at the Regatta Hotel downriver. And we're providing transportation for that, free maxi taxis from in front of the Women's College. So let me give you a bit more information about all that. So like I said, there's a songlines talk after the symposium. It's very interesting. It's controversial, right? It's something that was kind of hard for us to actually have happen. So it's unlikely that it might happen again, So it's really worth attending and seeing what they're talking about. A lot of you may have first heard about songlines from this controversial guy a couple decades ago now, Bruce Chatwin. And he wrote this book called The Songlines. How many of you have heard about songlines or Bruce Chatwin? Not many, right? So I was surprised that there are Australians in my lab. I became Australian recently, but there are Australian nationals in my lab, and they hadn't heard about the songlines. And I said, how can you consider yourself Australian? You never even heard about this concept. Sorry, Leonie and Aresha. It's just, it's such an interesting thing that people sing their way through the environment and make a cognitive map of their environment. It's just so interesting. So I encourage you to attend that talk. So after the songlines talk is the social. Like I said, it's at a classic Australian tavern, the Regatta. There'll be free beer and wine and spirits and finger food again, but potential to buy a steak if you're really hungry. We'll be providing taxis to get there. I'll just show you where in a moment. And if you miss the taxis, you can always go to the City Cat, and it's just 2 stops down from UQ by City Cat. And when you step out of the City Cat stop there, it's pretty obvious. It's the hotel, the lit up thing right in front with a 4X sign, and that's where it's at. And just ask for the ASSC event. So we're here at AEB now. The taxis will leave from in front of the Women's College in various stages of succession. If you miss them, just go to the UQ ferry stop, the City Cat stop, and you can get to the Regatta from there. All right, so let's transition now to the... Yes? Sorry? No, it's open for everybody. Good point. Anybody can go there. and get some free beer and food, and we'll see until it runs out. There's a tab. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so one useful way of generating hypotheses about what consciousness is to think about ways in which particular types of conscious experiences might have been adaptive for the organisms that have them in competition with organisms that don't have those conscious experiences. And so we can think about, it's interesting to think about the fact that adaptive experience, these adaptive accounts have been put forward in a number of cases by people that you're all familiar with here. But one thing that's worth noting is that an adaptive explanation for one particular type of experience is not necessarily going to apply to other types of experience. So an explanation for why conscious visual experiences is adaptive might not necessarily apply to pain. It might not necessarily apply to being conscious of inner speech, et cetera, et cetera. So whenever we're talking about these adaptive explanations, there's going to be this interesting question about how broadly it applies to other types of experiences. So in my brief introduction to these really interesting speakers that are coming up, I want to make the case that thinking about how conscious experience of pain could be adaptive is a particularly interesting endeavor that's likely to yield fruitful results. So a couple of reasons to think that pain is particularly important in terms of this context of adaptive accounts. One thing is that just from appealing to our own subjective experiences, when you think about really intense pains, so not just sort of minor everyday pains that we have through going through life, but very intense pains, that's one of the most salient and powerful types of experiences that we could possibly have. And not only is the experience very powerful, but it's interesting in the fact that it's very attention demanding. It's sort of a greedy experience where really intense, painful experiences make it difficult to focus on anything else. It demands a lot from our conscious awareness, and it demands a lot from our attention. So pains are experiences that are particularly powerful and particularly salient for us. So in light of this, it seems like it would be particularly cruel if the world turned out such that we have these really unpleasant experiences that actually have no role in our behavior or play no role in helping organisms exist over time. Now, I realize that saying that X entails that the world is cruel is not really an argument for X being false, but I think a lot of people in the room are here because we have this feeling that our conscious experiences matter in the world and lead us to do certain things. And I think painful experiences are a particularly good case of this. The unpleasantness of pain seems like it has a very powerful effect on us. So that's one reason for thinking that this connection between pain and behavior that might be useful is a particularly valuable thing. The other thing is that pain, normal everyday pains, are associated with all different types of behavior that themselves have clear adaptive advantages. So in the outback or wherever, being able to withdraw when something is chewing on your leg is a pretty good skill to have. And similarly, learning to avoid things that chew on your leg would also be very helpful for an organism that's trying to survive. So there are all types of behaviors that are typically associated with pains that seem to be adaptive and seem to play an important role. But interestingly, a lot of the behaviors that are associated with painful experiences can actually occur when pains are not consciously experienced. So to take the obvious example, withdrawing from a noxious stimulus has been shown to occur in a number of different situations where people are not actually conscious or not consciously experiencing pain. Similarly, there are a number of types of learning that can occur that are normally associated with pain, such as certain types of conditioning, where noxious stimulus delivered at sort of subconsciousness thresholds, or in people who are not conscious at all, can nevertheless induce learning. So there are cases where behaviors that you might think would be good examples of how pain is adaptive do not actually involve conscious pains. And taking it a step further, there's also a number of cases where one particular aspect of pain experiences seems to be missing, even though the phenomenology for other aspects of pain seems to be present. So if aspects of the pain or the affective pathway are impaired temporarily or permanently through lesions, there are cases of people who report feeling pain but no longer finding it unpleasant. So in other words, long story short, the link between the conscious experience of pain and particularly the unpleasantness of pain is not going to be an easy link to some adaptive explanation. It's going to be somewhat subtle and somewhat complicated. And so that was really what we had in mind in putting together the panel today. We wanted to bring together a diverse set of methodologies and consider a diverse range of species to try to answer this question of how the conscious experience of pain might be related to adaptive behavior. And so in terms of the diversity of methodologies, we have Victoria Braithwaite, who's in the biology department at Penn State, David Edelman, who's a neuroscientist, and Paula Droege, who's a philosopher. So we have a number of different perspectives that are going to weigh in on this. Victoria is an expert on fish. David, as I'm sure you all know, is had done some really interesting work on cephalopods. And Dan Weary, who was going to be here, was going to be talking about mammals. So unfortunately, that part is missing because Dan had some health issues in his family and he's not going to be here. But another part of what we were thinking of when we put together this panel is we really did want it to be something where the audience would chime in and offer different approaches, different perspectives on the work that we're bringing, because we feel like we're presenting a couple of approaches that may not be, in the typical ASSC program. So the good news about Dan not being here is that we will set aside extra time for questions and answers, and we'd be really interested in hearing your feedback on ways of testing or looking at conscious pain in animals. In particular, Victoria and Daniel Weary are going to be involved in a project in Berlin starting next year examining conscious pain in fish. So I would really encourage you in the Q&A here or afterwards to come talk to Victoria if you have any suggestions for how to think about that question. With that in mind, just a brief comment on the format is going to be changed a little bit, where each speaker is going to talk for 20 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes of questions while we're switching over, and then we should have a good chunk of time at the end for questions and answers. So I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Victoria Braithwaite. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm going to kick off with this question about whether fish feel pain, but just before I do start this, I want to say that I wouldn't be able to stand here and talk about this if I didn't have a number of very excellent and wonderful colleagues who I've been interacting with over the last few years. Highlighted in red up here is one of the speakers who's going to come later, because Paula and I have a very good current collaboration, and so I hope I'm going to pave the way for some of the things she's going to talk about when she gets up here herself. Back in 2000, a Chilean artist called Marco Evaristi set up a rather interesting display at the Trapholt Danish Art Gallery, which involved a number of food blenders and goldfish, and they were connected up to electrical sockets. And Evaristi said that what he wanted to do with this particular display was to have the audience wrestle with their conscience. And that was all he said. But the result was a number of fish were blended because people could switch the blenders on. The Trapholt director, the art gallery director, was charged with animal cruelty, but later acquitted. And it caused a real stir. And what was very interesting about this particular display was that it really polarized people's opinion about whether fish in particular feel pain. Some people found the very idea that you would be prepared to push that switch as really quite abhorrent, and yet other people didn't shrink away from it at all. It was not a problem for them to actually flick that switch. So I think it sets up this, the fish pain debate is rather interesting. There are people who think it's a very clear-cut case of it's obvious, isn't it? I mean, why would you even get out of bed to answer this question? It's just clear, they do feel pain. Whereas there are a huge number of people out there who deny this capacity to these organisms. So who's right, and how can we tell? Well, first of all, let's have just a quick overview of what we mean by pain. Adam did a very nice introduction there by saying that first and foremost, it's adaptive. Animals that can protect themselves are more likely to survive, and they're going to leave more offspring. So it's an adaptive process evolutionarily. But we also think of it in terms of it being a subjective process, so a feeling that only the individual experiences. And this is where we begin to get a little bit murky as to which animals may actually have that particular component or capacity. So broadly speaking, we can think about pain as being this two-step process. We have the nociceptive process, which is the unconscious detection of damage, and that can occur at the level of the spinal cord. It doesn't have to go up to the brain. But then we have this second phase, this experience of the hurt, and by that we're thinking then in terms of this conscious awareness of the pain. So if Dan had been here, Dan Weary had been here, he would be telling us that certainly in mammals, there is plenty of evidence that they have these nociceptors and subjective capacities for pain. So if we look at mammals, for example, we can look at foot withdrawal responses to a hot plate. We can look at the pain receptors that are in the skin, and certainly rodents have these plenty distributed around the skin and other tissues. Similarly, in birds, if you look at birds, and this particular work, or the figure that's drawn here, was some work that was done on battery-caged hens, where there are problems with arthritic joints, or broken limbs associated with the farming practice. And the little dots and stars and symbols that you see on the leg there are areas where nociceptors have been detected. So the nociceptors are present there in the legs of these birds. But what about fish? Well, when we came to this question about a decade ago, or just over a decade ago now, we were really staggered that nobody had actually asked these questions before. Do fish have nociceptors? Nobody looked, nobody knew. So the obvious place for us to start when we looked at this work was to determine whether nociceptors are present in fish. And then if they are there, if you stimulate those, do we see changes in the behavior? And then we wanted to go on and look at this third, more difficult question of, well, what sort of evidence do we have then that if these nociceptors are stimulated, are the fish actually suffering because of pain associated with that detection of noxious damage? Nociceptors are present. It's probably not that surprising. I hope it's not that surprising to most of you here that they are indeed there. So when we went in and we looked, it was fairly easy to isolate a number of different kinds of nociceptors. So there are receptors that pick up thermal information, those that pick up mechanical damage, crushing, and also chemical kinds of damage. So here what you see is a trout's head, and across that head we see the distribution of the receptors there. Also down below you can see another sensitive part of the body, the eye, the cornea. Again, there are plenty of nociceptors present on that structure. And so the figure above just simply shows that if you drop a very weak acetic acid solution onto one of these chemical nociceptors, we get this very rapid burst of firing in response to that chemical stimulation. So the nociceptors are present, and when you stimulate them, they're active, and we can record that. Once those receptors have picked up the information, that information is then transmitted or conveyed through the nervous system, through specialized nerve fibers. So within the nerve, there are two kinds of fiber, A delta fibers and C fibers, that take that information and transmit it further, either first to the spine and then to the brain. In the case of the trigeminal nerve here, it goes straight to the brainstem. When we look in the fish, if we take a section of the trigeminal nerve, which is what you can see in, I have to coordinate myself here. What you can see here is that this is a section through the nerve fiber, and detecting the myelin here, that's what we're actually able to pick out in this particular image. You can see that there are a series of smallish fibers, which are the A delta fibers, and then these harder to see C fibers because they lack myelin, but nevertheless they're there in small clusters. So again, the fish have the hardware that's associated with this nociceptive stage, or the first stage of pain detection. What's interesting when we look at the fish is that actually they have many fewer C fibers than birds and mammals. Quite what the significance of that smaller number is isn't clear. It could be something to do with the fact that they're in an aquatic environment, which is much more buffered than the terrestrial environment, but we're still not sure about that. But nevertheless, the two kinds of fiber type are present. So far so good. They've got the neural hardware. What happens now behaviorally when those are stimulated in some way? What I'm going to show you now are 3 very short clips of trout trying to feed on 2 different kinds of prey. The first video clip is a trout feeding on, why can I not get my mouse coming up? Come on. Here we go, on this smooth-backed Gammarus. And then the second 2 clips are trout trying to feed on this a close relative which has spines along its back. And the question is do the fish respond to those spines in some way? So the first clip I'll warn you now is quick. Blink and you'll miss it. So here we have the trout very easily ingesting that smooth-back prey. Not a problem. Now we have one of these spiny critters, and you can see that the trout is actually having quite a lot more trouble trying to get this critter into a stage where, or situation where it can actually consume it and swallow it. So what it's doing is it keeps spitting it out, trying to reorient it, and eventually it's able to consume it. But it took more than twice as long to actually do that. Here's an example of one trial learning. Despite the same duration of the trial here, that fish never went back to try and feed on that particular spiny form. So that, somewhat anecdotal, but that video evidence rather suggests that there are sensitive parts inside the mouth. So it's not just on the outside of the skin, inside the mouth there seem to be sensitive areas. So when we experience something painful or we inflict pain stimuli on other mammals and birds, we know that one of the first things that happens is there's a drop in the motivation to feed. So here's some work that we did to simply look at whether we got the same kind of effect. Is there a decrease in motivation to feed when the fish have been stimulated in some way? So here we have a comparison between 2 control groups, a group that were just simply handled, and then a group that were given a small injection of saline into the snout, which is what you can see going on at the top here, compared to 2 groups which were treatment groups, which were either given a small injection of bee venom or acetic acid. So anyone who's been stung by a bee before knows that it is extremely painful, and that's largely because there are toxins in the bee venom which cause localized swelling. In the case of acetic acid, you've got ions in there which are causing nips and irritation and a stinging sensation. So if we look here at the amount of time it took the fish to start feeding again after they'd been treated, either in these two control ways or in terms of these noxious stimulus ways, here you see it takes about an hour after the anesthesia and handling or the saline injection before they begin to feed again. In the case of the bee venom and acetic acid, it took much longer, closer to 3 hours in this case here. Another observation that we found was that the fish that had been given the acetic acid also showed very dramatic rubbing of the snout area, the area where the injection had gone in, against the hard surfaces inside the tank. And again, any of you who've had either lemon juice or vinegar into an open cut know that it stings and it is relatively painful in that way. So perhaps the fish are responding particularly to that sort of irritation when they're doing this rubbing. Another kind of physiological response that we can measure is something like an increase in respiration rate or stress hormones such as cortisol. I haven't got the cortisol data here, but I am showing you here that, again, if we look at those 4 different groups, if we treat the groups, this is their background gill beat rate, but then if you treat the animals either with the control or the saline versus the bee venom and acetic acid, we see big differences here in terms of how exaggerated the gill beat rate increase is for these 2 noxious treatment groups, and that continues for quite some time until all the groups come back down to a background level again at the end. And again, in addition, something we also saw in these 2 noxious treatment groups was rocking as the fish rested on the gravel. So, and again, a rocking motion or rocking behavior is sometimes connected with coping behavioral responses. So in terms of what we've seen so far, and going back to this idea of what is pain, certainly we've seen that nociception is there. And a lot of the behavioral evidence that I've shown you there, you could say that there's suggestions there that the fish are actually certainly detecting the pain. But are they actually aware of it? So is there this conscious experience that something is hurting in the fish? And I've put Bentham up here simply because of this quote here, and a lot of the work that I do is related towards animal welfare. You know, Bentham was one of the early proponents of asking this question, or stating, the question is not can they reason or can they talk, but actually can they suffer? And so the whole point here is we're interested in whether they're able to process this hurt. So how can we have a look at that? Well, one of the things we can do is to look at where in the brain this information might be being processed. So a number of experiments have now done remote recording or individual cell recording in the brain after the fish has been treated in some way, either by a needle prod or an electric shock applied to the tail. And if you look at where those signals are passing up, they're definitely passing through the brain stem, through the cerebellum, and then they are recorded within the telencephalon, so within the forebrain. And we know from lesion experiments in fish that the telencephalon has specialized regions that are functionally very similar to the hippocampus and the amygdala. And we know that because if you remove those areas or you temporarily impair them, then those animals that have had that impairment or lesioning now have problems in terms of finding their way around a maze that they may have learned before, and certainly have problems in terms of fear conditioning and so forth, so fear-based cognition. Another experiment we did to try and look at this was to look at attention. Again, we've been hearing various talks that have thought about this as a way to sort of try and infer some awareness and consciousness. So here, what we were trying to do was to determine that the response that we're seeing in the fish here is more than some kind of reflex response. So what we wanted to do was to look at changes in attentional state, and we decided we could do this by looking at how the fish responded to novel objects. Fish find novel objects, or typically find novel objects, neophobic. They have a fear of something novel in the environment until they've figured out that it's not dangerous, and then they're prepared to approach it. So what we did in these experiments was to very simply put a very technical piece of equipment into the tank. It was literally a Lego. I had young kids at the time and lots of Lego around the house, so I made a very colorful Lego, or several colorful Lego towers, placed them into the tank about 10 centimeters away from the head of the fish, and then looked at how the fish responded. And again, because we were interested in this response to the noxious stimulation, some of the fish had been given a small injection of acetic acid, weak acetic acid, and the other group had had saline. So here what you can see is how much time these fish are now spending closer to the object. If they're moving closer to the object, less than 5 centimeters, they're actually moving towards that object and not showing the normal standard neophobic avoidance response. And you can see here the strong contrast between the treatment group given the control group given the saline versus those given the acetic acid. So the fish given the acetic acid seem to have trouble here doing the normal avoidance response. Now, if it's the case that that truly is a response associated with an inability to focus and attend to that novel object, you ought to be able to reverse this effect by now providing the fish with pain relief. So what we did was to repeat this experiment, but this time we gave both groups a small amount of morphine, and now what you find is that the difference here between the groups has disappeared. So you treat the fish with something that we believe is noxious, the vinegar, or the weak acetic acid solution. You impair their ability to focus and concentrate on that novel object. You provide them with pain relief. Their ability to focus and concentrate is now reinstated. So we've used that as, we think, or my group and I have used this as we think, fairly compelling evidence that the fish are aware and attending to pain when they're experiencing it. Now, we've had a lot of criticisms thrown at us for this work, and there are still a lot of people out there, particularly anglers actually, who don't want to hear this message, and I get quite a lot of interesting emails along these lines of that I'm some kind of enemy when it comes to fishing. That's not necessarily the case, but it has got us thinking, or it got my colleague Paula and I thinking about, well, what other ways could you actually determine whether fish are consciously aware? And so what we've been trying to do over the last couple of years is to think about, in this case, an alternative approach to look at consciousness. And one of the things we're trying to do here is to say, well, if we can prove this for fish, which are rather a difficult case to prove, then potentially we could come up with a framework where we could look at consciousness in animals more generally by trying to apply these ideas that we've developed for the fish. So what I'd like to do in the last part, what I'd like to do now is fairly quickly move through, and Paula's going to come back to this as well, is to sort of put this case that we think that temporal representations are what's critical here. So we think that they are important for the animal in terms of its internal phenomenology and the external behavior and the neural structure. So what do I mean by that? What we're trying to argue here is that flexible adaptation to novel conditions is often taken as a signal for consciousness. And we think that if you can apply this in a range of different contexts and a range of different ways, you can actually use these ideas to think about whether the animal is consciously aware. So if you think about the sorts of issues that animals have to solve, sometimes there's a need to distinguish with how things are now compared to how things might have been otherwise. That might be important for the animal if it's choosing to flee or approach a simple stimulus or response. Sorry, approach a particular stimulus. But of course, sometimes there's more than one alternative, and so the animal has to make decisions about the particular alternative that it should pursue. We can think about it in terms of the animal being slightly more sophisticated and thinking about these alternative representations. And so we are wanting to think about how the animal processes this understanding of the now and uses that to actually underpin this flexible behavior that allows it to then make informed decisions. And I'm going to skip that one and just say that there are examples, we think, out there for fish which actually illustrate this very nicely. So there are paradigms such as cleaner fish, where cleaner fish come in and clean client fish, and those cleaner-client interactions set up some very interesting dynamics, not least of which because cleaner fish often cheat and don't just take the ectoparasites off the client fish, they sometimes take a chunk out of the client fish itself. And so we end up with situations where sometimes the cleaners are cheating and sometimes they're being cooperative. And there are very interesting dynamics that set up about when the cleaner should cooperate and when it actually will cheat. And I'll show you some data just for that in a minute. Another example, which is quite interesting, which I'm going to go through these fairly swiftly, is transitive inference and the fact that fish are actually able to do this, so learning a particular sequence or logical progression. We also see that fish are capable of manipulating their world such that they can use tools of sorts. And also thinking in terms of explicit representation, there are many examples of how fish have very impressive spatial representations of the environment, allowing them to make novel shortcuts or escape routes. Just very quickly then, so these cleaner fish, one of the things that's been worked on recently is to look at what happens when there's an individual bystander here, so an observer, watching client and cleaner fish interactions over here. And the way that this is set up is that the use of one-way mirrors means that this bystander is invisible to these guys on the outside here. If you observe how much cheating goes on, so some cleaners are very cooperative, some cheat a lot. If you look at the response of these bystanders in terms of which cleaner they prefer, having watched interactions going on, you can see here that the number of client jolts that are made compared to where the observer, this bystander will choose to go, means that the client fish are actually making informed decisions, and they will prefer to go and spend time closer to cleaners that are more cooperative and do less jolting. So they spend more time next to those individuals that are not cheating. In a follow-on from that, they went on and they removed those one-way mirrors, so now the bystander is visible to the cleaner and his client. And what they observed under these conditions is that when the cleaner is aware that they're being watched, they will cooperate more. So the cleaners will nip less when they're being watched, which is really quite intriguing. Here is the transitive inference experiment. I'm running out of time, so yeah, okay, so I'll finish up here. But just very simply, fish are able to learn these logical progressions. You can use fighting fish and staged fights between individuals to actually set this paradigm up. And the fish are extremely good at learning these sequences and will predict who will be the winner and loser associated with these sequences. The tool use is a very interesting one, and if you're interested in actually having a look at this, go onto YouTube and Google, YouTube, tuskfish tool use, and you'll see a really neat little video of a fish using a strong piece of rock or a particular rock as an anvil. And my favorite example is this frillfin goby. It's an old example now, but a goodie, which is that this little goby at high tide will use the topography of the landscape, and it learns that topography at high tide, to figure out at low tide, when it's threatened, where the depressions are, so that it can very accurately find escape routes and jump literally from one pool to the next pool, and it never hits dry land because it's learned at high tide where those depressions are. So taking all this together, I hope that I've convinced you, although I think many of you here probably didn't need that much convincing before, but trust me, my audiences usually do, that fish do feel pain, and that if you were tempted before I gave the talk to maybe think about flicking that switch, I hope that you're not now. Thank you. Why do people not? I think it's largely because of people who fish are very concerned about what it might mean if those fish are experiencing pain to the rest of the public, to us. So in the same way that we have some objections about whether we should hunt terrestrial animals, should we actually allow fishing if we know that those animals are suffering because of the way in which we're pursuing them? In actual fact, if you look at the way anglers, or I think good anglers know what they're doing, they're incredibly careful about how they handle the fish, particularly if they're releasing that fish after capture. So I think they already know, many of them, that they do, otherwise they wouldn't handle them in quite the way that they do. But certainly it is a large group of people there that are concerned about it. The other group that I get, in fact I've just had to take on in terms of a debate, have been fishing for fish at sea. And actually the way that we do that is not particularly humane. And there are better ways that we could do it. We have to use better ways when we farm fish and we harvest fish on fish farms. So the technology is now there to actually harvest fish more humanely. And the question is should we be applying that to the way we go out and catch fish at sea? You know, we can do that now. Maybe we should be applying that.
What do you think are the implications of your own research? Yeah, what do you think are the implications of your research on your own research, because in the end you're also inflicting pain on animals. I bet you get this question all the time, but how do you reconcile the...
I do, and David I think is going to talk a little bit about this too. I mean, yeah, these are not easy experiments to do, and we are extremely careful about looking at the sample sizes of animals that we're going to use. And you know, we've done this work now. We don't need to do it again, but we needed to do this to show that this was what the fish were capable of and how they responded. So a small amount of pain needs to be inflicted to actually determine that this is a capacity and it's there. But we know that now, and the evidence is there. So hopefully we don't need to do many more of these kinds of experiments.
Do you think it's plausible that there are some kinds of fish, because there are so many kinds of fish out there, whose ecological niche or whose way to survive requires actually those to not to have pain as an advantage, for the evolutionary viewpoint. And if there are such as fish, do you think that they don't have nociceptors?
So that's also a good question. I mean, so you picked up on two things that I should have said in my talk. So fish are incredibly diverse in species. We have over 30,000 species of fish, which is more than all the mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians put together. And they are incredibly diverse, and we see a huge variation in terms of their nervous system and the habitats that they inhabit and so forth. And you can think of fish as being from the sort of more ancient lines of the cartilaginous fish, like the sharks, through to the more sophisticated bony fish. If we look at the sharks, they have a very different kind of nociceptive system, and you could potentially argue there that as a predator, and who knows why, they have that particularly, so if you think about what a shark has to put up with in order to go and catch its prey sometimes, it probably makes sense that they have this different system and less of a capacity for pain perception. But there's still a lot of work to be done to try and make those comparisons between the different species. So I think it's a good question. I think there will be interesting answers to be had if we go out and we actually look at that.
Right, looks like we're mostly on schedule, so we should have time to ask Victoria more questions at the end. But our next speaker right now is David Edelman.
Great. I just want to make sure everybody can hear me and I'm not blowing you out the door, right, with the sound, because I have a horrible habit of over-enunciating and being too loud with a good mic on me. Anyway, so I'm sort of the odd man out here because I think Victoria's work makes whatever I've thought about and whatever, in fact, has been done by, I would say, probably the less than 30 cephalopod groups active in the world today, look like not much of anything, because it's been a very sleepy, cephalopodology, so-called, has been a very sleepy sort of area. And it's kind of shocking for a variety of reasons. First of all, not the least of which is that this is an extraordinarily interesting animal. It's got a huge brain, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's rather extraordinary. I'm always the eyes of these animals always capture my attention because they're sort of so alert. They're looking at you, they track you, they can move their eyes. You'll see their eyes moving in their mantle to follow different objects. But they're quite fascinating. The other thing that's sort of shocking is that cephalopods really, if you think about it, are the start of modern neurophysiology. Back in the late 30s, Huxley and J.Z. Young were thinking about these various problems. And in fact, they isolated the giant squid axon and were able to make a preparation that told us a whole lot about synaptic function and revolutionized modern neurophysiology and all of modern neuroscience. So for the past 4 years or so, there's been a flurry of activity, and the activity can be easily traced if you go to highwire.org or PubMed or any of those large search engines. You can see a lot of papers have come out in the past 4 years involving, suddenly, the identification and management of pain, analgesia in cephalopods, all kinds of stuff. And there is one overriding reason for this. It's not so much that cephalopod researchers have gained sort of a strain of humanity. They have humanity. They're very humane people. It's that the EU has just, well, not just, but rather recently, introduced a new directive, which basically states that cephalopods have to be managed in the same way in terms of pain and suffering and generally humane treatment as other animals that we're accustomed to managing in humane ways in the States: rats, mice, rabbits, dogs, et cetera, et cetera. But now in Europe, following suit from Great Britain or the UK back about 20 years ago, cephalopods are covered under animal protection, and any IACUC committee has to sort of worry about any kinds of procedures that are proposed by scientists studying various cephalopods. Is it? Oh, yeah. Let me do that. Yeah, that's the noise, I'm sure. Thank you. Okay, is that better? No more shuffling around. Okay, so sort of a seminal quote that kind of summarizes the state of octopus or cephalopod research in regard, in particular, to pain and suffering, anesthesia, analgesia, et cetera, is this: a review of the published literature for evidence of nociceptors and for the perception of pain in cephalopods can be summarized as absence of evidence rather than evidence of absence. Okay, I will cite for you a couple of papers which have at least demonstrated putative nociception in squid. But there's really not much else to deal with here. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is a little bit speculative, or at least I'm going to give you a roadmap as to what we should be concern ourselves with if we're interested in cephalopod nociception and pain and where we need to go. So let me give you a laundry list of the stuff that I, as somebody who was interested in studying cephalopods' brain and behavior, made to sort of think about what is necessary and sufficient for animal pain. So first of all, of course, nociception. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, as you've probably heard before. You need to have receptors that detect tissue damage from changes in temperature, in some cases, not in all cases, however. Chemical substances, mechanical force. This last one is particularly important if you're a cephalopod. The first one isn't terribly important. In fact, we haven't found any evidence of temperature-related nociception in cephalopods or any convincing evidence as of yet. Associated neural circuitry that triggers withdrawal or avoidance responses is important. Okay? Cephalization. This is something that should be rather obvious, but it's not something that gets stated very often when we talk about invertebrates, but it kind of makes sense. Why is cephalization something that's sort of necessary for pain? Okay. You need some sort of a centralized nervous system because you have to have somewhere where stuff comes together. You need to have a place where you can integrate multimodal exteroceptive and interoceptive sensory inputs. Okay? You need sophisticated memory systems to some extent for all of this stuff. You need some way to modulate the pain response. Likely centrally, it makes more sense. It's much more adaptive to do it that way. It's much less wasteful. You wouldn't want to do it locally. And so, therefore, you also need, in some sense, descending pathways akin to the kinds of descending pathways that we've identified in the vertebrates. You need an attentional system for a variety of reasons, one of which has come up already in Victoria's talk. And this will come up, I hope, in discussion later. And finally, obviously, some subjective experience that we call pain, feelings of pain. And important in that, of course, is something like emotional valence, right? And some sort of sustain of the sensation, a sustained sensation post-injury to some extent is something I think we can often associate with pain. Okay, so that's good enough. So which invertebrates actually experience pain? We have a lot to choose from. We have crustaceans. This is a mantis shrimp, a peacock mantis shrimp, actually, I believe. These are honeybees, of course, doing the waggle dance. This is well, that's not a spider. That's a bee, but a spider is about to leap onto the bee. And that's a cephalopod who, unfortunately, is not moving. If he were moving, he'd give you quite a nice strobe effect. We won't worry about him. So the distinction has already been made, but should be made again to reinforce that if we're talking about nociception, we're talking about one necessary attribute, sort of the peripheral attribute that makes pain possible, but not the whole gamish that is the pain response. So in the case of nociception, of course, many invertebrates seem to have it. We can include in that list some fairly humble invertebrates, Caenorhabditis elegans, C. elegans, Aplysia, Drosophila certainly. In the case of subjective experience, it gets a lot trickier, right? So there are a lot of question marks you can see here. I'm not going to, it's obvious what I mean when I put the question marks down there. It's very, very unclear. We just don't have any evidence at all in this regard. We've identified this whole notion of subjective experience in some vertebrates, most notably, of course, ourselves. We have the benefit of accurate report. Fish are certainly within this territory. We don't know about amphibians. We certainly don't really know a whole lot about reptiles, but certainly mammals are included in all of this. So this is sort of these two different columns. Nociception leading to subjective experience, of course, is the one that we're sort of most interested in. Okay. So nociception seems to be pretty ubiquitous among all multicellular organisms, right? It's necessary, but it's not sufficient for the experience of pain. Here's a critter that has it, we believe. Very humble, but very well known in neuroscience. Marine snail, Aplysia californica. Here's C. elegans. Right? 302 neurons, that's it. But something like nociception. Okay. So, markers for nociception and pain, I think would include, and this is not necessarily an exhaustive list, would include behavior such as withdrawal and avoidance, long-term memory of some sort, I believe, to some extent, but, not necessarily. Behavioral plasticity, higher order discriminations, attention. These are all certainly important for both, for pain, certainly, not necessarily for the first, for nociception. Anatomy, we need to have excitatory and inhibitory systems. We need areal specialization for sensory integration and modulation. We need ascending and descending neural circuitry, I believe, and I think that is something that is probably a sine qua non of pain, I think, in any animal. In terms of molecular biology, we can certainly trace various molecular and pharmacological markers that indicate pain processing, or at least are consistent with pain processing, homologous neurotransmitters, neuropeptides, receptors. In one particular case, we can look at particular phenomena at the level of synapses and watch for certain key events. The recruitment of GLUR1 AMPA receptor subunits to synaptic membranes is a very important aspect in the vertebrate case and does relate to the pain response. And finally, physiology, the central modulation and or amelioration of pain through analgesia or anesthesia. Opioid and fMRI, amyloid receptors are certainly known. They've been identified in animals such as octopus and squid. And finally, electrical signaling processes that are consistent with the vertebrate case. This is a little trickier because we don't have much in the way of, we've identified some kinds of signaling processes that are consistent with pain, but we're not really good on that front. So here's the low-hanging fruit if we're talking about cephalopods. Relatively low. Everything is relative. This is relative. This is not by any means easy to do, any of this stuff, to identify these things in yellow. But they're the lowest of the fruit that I list here. Okay. So there's a lot of commonality in vertebrates and invertebrates in terms of both small and, to some extent, some larger structures. But at the molecular and cellular level, if you look at neurons, if you look at the presynapse side and the postsynapse side of neurons across the vertebrates and the invertebrates, there's incredible commonality. There's incredible conservation of these signaling pathways. So there's a lot of commonality there. The building blocks are all there. Now, just going back up into scale and to rehash something that Victoria had already sort of shown, this is basically a cartoon of showing the ascending and descending mammalian pain pathways. And I'm only putting it up here. I'm not going into any depth here. I'm putting it up here to emphasize the challenge that we have ahead of us in terms of identifying something similar, something analogous in a cephalopod, in this strange marine animal. By extension, people have taken anatomy and they've linked it to models that I guess one would call psychological models of nociception, pain, unpleasantness, and affect. This is adapted from a 2000 Science paper, but basically it gives you a general idea of what you might envision the psychology of pain perception to look like. And various structures are invoked in this in the vertebrate. The anterior cingulate cortex is particularly prominent. The prefrontal cortex is certainly prominent high up in terms of processing what becomes known to us as pain, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and all that. But we have a huge problem, and here's some obvious stuff. We have signatures in terms of activation patterns in the brain, in the human brain in this case, for painful stimuli, okay? We know something, we know a thing or two about descending modulatory systems for managing pain in the vertebrate nervous system. But when we get to the octopus, it's going to be quite a chore to really understand what's going on. Okay, so we can certainly do sort of all the basics. People for decades have done major learning and memory sorts of studies on octopus, and in that process they've used classical conditioning. They've done avoidance conditioning. In this particular example, what you're seeing is a cartoon of an octopus being exposed to a ball that delivers a shock between 12 and 24 volts DC, and the animal very quickly learns to avoid that red ball, as opposed to a white ball, which might be associated with the delivery of fish, at which point the octopus just jumps on the ball as if it's a fish every time it sees the ball, even if there's no fish around. People have studied long-term potentiation in relation to this particular response, the avoidance conditioned response. And centrally, they've excised or cut away a particular connection between two brain areas in the octopus that totally ablate this conditioning, or basically make it impossible. And in this particular case, what they're doing is they're getting rid of a particular aspect of long-term potentiation in an important circuit for memory for these animals. Okay, so here's the basic idea. You basically condition the animal to the white ball for fish. You condition the animal to the red ball for shock. And I guess I'm going to have to step over here and activate some of these movies. And so in this particular case, on the right-hand side, you see a red ball, which has been associated negatively with, in this particular case, I believe it's shock. And what happens is you're seeing different trials over time cut together. And so over time, you can see he's just barely touching it. And then eventually, he's not even going to go for it at all. He's going to do everything he can to avoid it. OK. So that's great. OK, so maybe that ball is delivering a nociceptive signal of some sort. That is certainly likely, right? An electric shock. The octopus has some sort of a receptor that responds to it. And you get nociception. But that's not pain. All right, so molecular, physiological, and behavioral evidence from the vertebrate case can provide a reference for investigating possible nociception and pain in invertebrates. Fine, in principle. Here is one of the few, in fact, one of 2 or 3, literally, studies involving identifying nociception in a cephalopod. In this case, it's a squid. This is work that was done by Robin Crook and her colleagues. She's at the University of Texas right now. So they took squids. They had 3 different groups of squids. They had control squid. They had pseudo-blindfolded squid with a sham injury that is not really injured. They had blindfolded squid, also sham injured. You might be wondering why they're even bothering with blindfolds and mock blindfolds. I'll get to that in a second. So the reason for that is they want to see whether the animal will come to associate or generalize to visual or other stimuli in relation to a nociceptive stimulus that has just activated some nociceptive response. Okay? And so in this case, this is a defensive response in the squid following an arm injury. And what happens is they blow ink. They plume ink. It's a standard response in squid, usually associated with this escape. But in this case, you can call it generally defensive. So in the case of no blindfold, you can see the ink plumes go way up in terms of how often this happens. In the case of the injury. And none of this is really a surprise. I mean, they're responding and they've associated. I mean, there's an association here. That's fine. This is more interesting because what's happening here is they're generalizing to some sort of a visual stimulus that they now associate with the initial injury. So in this case, you can understand why the blindfold sort of makes sense. You have, and you also want to control, of course, for the presence of the blindfold in the first place. So you have a mock blindfold that doesn't really blind the animal. So in this case, you can see that when they're faced with the visual response that they've come to associate with the initial injury, they have a dramatic sensitization to the presence of that visual stimulus, okay, as long as they can see it, right? And the same thing goes for the mock blindfold. But when you get to the fully blindfolded animal who can't see, nothing, not a surprise. So that previous bit was about escape jets. So this is the jetting response of the animal. Here you see something similar, but in this case it's the ink plume. And the ink plumes go way up in frequency in the case where the animal can actually see a visual stimulus and identify it and associate it with the initial injury. Okay? All right. So they've done other work, the same Robin Crook and her colleagues, on nociception, basically looking at mechanosensation in a detached fin. So they've looked for some sort of a response and evoked mechanosensory activity of some sort. They basically found it, and they can stimulate to a lesser or greater degree, lesser being here, greater being here, and watch the evoked activity increase in strength. Okay? And this is in the case of a so-called crush injury to a detached fin. And they're recording from this, obviously. And so this is more of the same. I'm going to kind of rush through this because you more or less get the point. But what they've done, basically, is they've made a relatively fair case for nociception between this study and the study before. There is something present in this fin that is behaving much like what we'd expect a nociceptor to behave like in another animal. Okay? So finally, here is a little bit showing you what they actually do. So here's, they're using a very fine filament attached to something that sort of looks like a hammer. It's just a handle. And they're sort of prodding the octopus to varying degrees and you know, at varying levels of amplitude. And you know, you're not seeing very much happening there. And so this is very frustrating, and it's sort of equivocal, I think. But the bottom line is that the work that they've done previously is reasonably good. So, you know, I'm willing to buy that there's nociception there. That's fine. I'm not surprised by it. Cephalization is something that I mentioned I think is obvious, okay? Based on the vertebrate case as well as neuroanatomical motifs in some invertebrates, it seems that the centralized neural integration and modulation are critical to the emergence of the experience of pain during evolution. This is fairly reasonable. All right, in the case of the octopus, it's fairly clear. It does have some degree of centralization, but it's a very curious case because it also has a bit of parallel distribution as well. More than half of its nervous system is outside of its central brain. Each one of these limbs, each one of these arms, has a node, has a fused bit of ganglia that contains 25 million cells, 25 million neurons in each arm, and then 200 million between the eyes. Not trivial, okay? And the nature of these structures functionally is still pretty unknown to us. We only have a few different areas that we've sort of surveyed in terms of learning and memory. Most notably the higher areas, vertical lobe and medial and superior frontal lobe up here, which are associated with visual and tactile memory. But we know nothing else, next to nothing else about the rest of the octopus brain. But we do know one thing that's going to complicate our jobs in terms of identifying pain. We know that the mapping in this animal's brain is totally alien, or it looks seemingly alien compared to what we see in the vertebrate case. For example, topography. In this particular case, if you try to map the animal's motor function, you would hope that they'd show something like the vertebrate and you'd have, you know, a sensory motor strip or something. You'd have something sort of obviously laid out topographically, and they don't, seemingly, apparently. I'm not sure I buy that, but there it is. If you detach their arms, their arms have spontaneous motor programs. In this particular case, you're seeing an unevoked, a passive arm extension. You're seeing an active arm extension on the right. They're generating some sort of, you know, they're putting current into it or whatever. But these arms can do this on their own. I've had an octopus arm walk up my arm independently of the octopus for 20 minutes. It had detached from the octopus, and it just walked up my arm. And it was alive for more or less 20 minutes. So the centralization is a theme, and you need it for various, you need it certainly for the pain response in the vertebrates. You certainly need it, I think, in the invertebrates. And octopus and other cephalopods are on that road. They're headed in that direction. But they don't quite have all of it centralized, and that's going to create a problem for us later. I won't go into depth here. This just shows you the different relative sizes of different brain areas in different animals. So they've studied the central brain extensively, to some extent anatomically, and in terms of its relative sizes of different areas. J.Z. Young tried to make a go of understanding sensory and motor systems as well as visual and tactile systems, and he tried to make preliminary maps, which he did do to some extent, but they're still pretty primitive. Okay, he mapped sensory discrimination in the common octopus and did quite a nice job of it. I've done some preliminary work in electrophysiology, just recording single units, just to show that I could do it. This is in the optic lobe. So we have techniques that are sort of on their way, but they're very rudimentary at this point. Subjective experience leaves us, I think, in a sort of a veritable ditch. Based on verbal and behavioral report, the fact of the experience of pain in the vertebrates seems undeniable, even if its precise mechanisms remain elusive. But in the invertebrate case, experimental designs that exploit behavioral report and other possible measures are not getting us there right now. They're at a very rudimentary stage. Okay? So this is sort of my wish list, and I'm going to end with this. So I think, among other things, what we could do is we could establish existence of opioid or putatively equivalent receptor populations in specific central brain regions, which would give us some indication that something interesting is happening relevant to pain. We could identify nociceptor subtypes. This is going to be a little tough, but it's possible. In the anatomical physiological area, we could establish the location and function of central integrative regions. We could look for ascending and descending signaling pathways analogous to those in the vertebrate case. And finally, behaviorally, we could try experiments that would at least imply the presence of pain perception. Self-administration of analgesia is one idea. Redirection of attention and therefore the modulation of correlates of pain might be another direction to go, and that's something that we have discussed. We discussed it at lunch yesterday, and it's something that could potentially be developed in these animals with some difficulty, but I don't think it's impossible. So that's pretty much it, and I'm going to leave you with the challenges that I see that are ahead. I'm not going to necessarily read through these, but suffice to say, we have challenges from the fact that this is an animal in a marine environment. Those challenges limit or greatly constrain what we can do physiologically, but it doesn't make it impossible. It just makes it harder. But we need to do all of these things. We need to have electrophysiology joined with behavioral experiments to really make sense of what's going on. And without that conjunction, I think we're going to find ourselves in a bit of a tough spot. Okay, and so that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I went over time.
So a couple minutes of questions for David while Paula gets.
I was just surprised. It seemed like you had a fairly sort of conservative approach to, or limits to what was required for pain. Things like shifting of attention, memory. I mean, if you have extreme pain, it's pretty hard to ignore it in the most advanced, in a human.
Sure.
So the lack of a capacity to shift attention, to me, just conceptually, I mean, maybe it's important, but maybe it's not. And things like, talk about associate learning, it's sort of evidence of pain perception, but it seems like you could have associated learning without pain.
Right.
Similarly, vice versa. So you seem to be asking this system to have more than I would have thought you'd absolutely need to have a rudimentary experience of pain.
Well, I think in the case of, let me replay this. In the case of the first part of your question, I think it's the idea that if you think of pain as something that is using a lot of, it's requiring a lot of attentional load, right? And that in certain cases, in the human case, I think we have some examples whereby you can sort of derail some aspects of pain. One example that I think of is the TENS unit, right? Now that's not exactly, that's electrophysiological, that's electrical. That's some sort of a distractor in one regard. But in terms of actual distraction, there have been cases where you can sort of throw somebody off the track and diminish their report of pain to some extent. So it's more about taking an animal's attention from pain itself, and considering that pain is exerting an attentional load, right? And then moving off that load and watching, essentially coming up with some sort of a behavioral report that tells you that the animal is sort of not, in as much pain. This is tricky, I'm hand-waving here, but that's what I sort of had in mind.
But would you consider an absence of that capacity to be evidence of an absence of pain? That's sort of more where I was getting. It seemed to me that you're asking too much of or potentially saying if these animals don't pass those tests, then there's no experience. There may be no experience of pain.
No, I mean, no, but I guess what has to happen is, one has to deploy a panoply of tests. That would probably not be, but I am being very conservative. I guess I'm being overly conservative, but yeah. Okay. Right.
Okay, well, thanks again to David, and our next speaker is Paula Drogi.
So I've aspired above my station technologically, so I'm going to be sort of maneuvering a couple of different computers and going back and forth with YouTube, but we'll have, hopefully it'll all go relatively smoothly. So why study non-human animals? Aside from a couple of cute videos, what could this research possibly tell us about consciousness without the so-called gold standard of subjective report? I'm here to argue that research on animals is not only possible, but essential to developing an adequate theory of consciousness. My title is an homage to Ruth Millikan's In Defense of Proper Function, where she argues for the importance of a historical, teleological description of mental content. What it is to have a thought about a banana, as opposed to an apple, is not to have a nice thought bubble about a banana. It's for the banana thought to have served some function in relation to bananas. You need a banana thought to get to bananas. It's quite simple, really, although trust me, the details get complicated quickly. I'm going to spare you the details in order to press a more sweeping point. And that is, a convincing solution to the explanatory gap depends on a description of consciousness in terms of function. Specifically, its function as a particular sort of representational content. Other things will be necessary to explanation as well, such as an understanding of sensation in terms of quality space, and an articulation of the mechanisms by which neural systems produce consciousness, to name just two other things that we'll need to know, and to give you a sense of my other methodological and conceptual commitments about consciousness. My claim is that these other developments will be insufficient without a description of consciousness in terms of function. The alert critic will have noticed that I simply deny the claim central to explanatory gap arguments. That consciousness is the hard problem because it cannot be described in terms of structure and function. Here's how Chalmers put it in his original paper. The easy problems are easy precisely because they concern the explanation of cognitive abilities and functions. By contrast, the hard problem is hard precisely because it is not a problem about the performance of functions. So if we accept the explanatory gap, we can imagine a microphysical duplicate of me, and here she is, Zombie Paula, with identical structure and function. She would stand here exactly like me, except she's conscious and she's not conscious. And I am conscious, possibly. There's an enormous literature on the question of whether we can actually imagine Zombie Paula. Maybe I'm not giving her all of the functions that I have, such as the ability to report conscious states or fine-grained sensory descriptions. So if she were here and actually describing what it's like to be her and to be in this audience and to feel anxiety and to see all you people, well then absolutely she would have to be conscious because she is able to do those things like introspection that are just what constitutes consciousness. Or we may be failing to fully understand that the neural structure of Zombie Paula is exactly the sort of mechanism that's necessary for consciousness. So perhaps if Zombie Paula is here and we measure her structure of information integration and she's processing information at a high phi, then that just is what it is for Zombie Paula to be conscious. So maybe we're not really imagining sufficiently. But I think a better way to respond to the critic is to focus on exactly what the structure and function of consciousness must be, and then consider whether the possibility of zombies is still a problem. Now that we're more clear on the structure and function of life, the possibility that Zombie Paula is not alive is no longer a problem. So if she were here, had the same structure and function as me, she was capable of homeostasis, capable of reproduction, whatever we want to tick off on our list of what it is to be alive, she has that. She's alive. That's not a problem. We don't expect elan vital. We're not looking for that anymore. And I expect that unconscious zombies will follow their undead cousins out of the realm of philosophical and scientific debate once we have a better theory of the function of consciousness. The place to begin is with the first-person examination of consciousness to see what features are, in fact, essential. The phenomenologist Edmund Husserl identified the temporal structure of consciousness as central to its most distinctive attributes, which are unity and flow. Consciousness binds sights, sounds, thoughts, and feelings together to form the experienced world. Yet that world is constantly in flux as attention and objects shift in space and time. The famous metaphor of time as a river fits perfectly with the metaphor of consciousness as a stream. Time and consciousness flow in sync, manifest in the present, moving towards the future, having traversed the past. Following this insight from Husserl, I've argued that the function of consciousness is to represent the world at the present moment. Consciousness tells us what is happening now in order to facilitate the flexible selection and pursuit of goals. It is this step, describing the nature of consciousness in terms of its function, that is crucial to solving the problem of the explanatory gap. The challenge for any proposed function of consciousness is, why think consciousness does that? Couldn't a creature do that without conscious experience? So in the introspective case, couldn't we have a machine, for example, that we program to report on its states, but it wouldn't be conscious? Information integration, couldn't we look at a system that has a hi-fi, but isn't conscious? It seems like we could. And here's where the description of consciousness in terms of the representation of presence can help connect behavior to phenomenology. A representation of the world now is not simply a representation that is occurring now. There are all kinds of representations that I'm having right now that are not part of what I'm representing as now. So my proprioceptive system is keeping my posture upright and preventing me from running into things. Those sorts of representations that are going on that I must have or I'd fall over flat are not part of what I'm consciously representing as occurring now. This is the idea that consciousness is selective in processing only some of the available sensory stimuli. And this selective process is designed to meet my needs as a human being. Illusions show how this selective design functions by making it malfunction. And let's see if we can get function here. So in the freezing rotation illusion, the words are rotating steadily but appear to freeze when the background rotation is in sync. So we've got it, no motion, motion, no motion, motion. Max Dursteler, whose version of this illusion was the winner of the 2006 illusion contest, suggests that the visual system ignores the regular motion of the smaller object in order to treat it as part of the larger surround. In other words, the motion representation is suppressed when the figure matches the ground. It's more important for the visual system to have a sense of the words as related to the background when they're in sync. What you want to know is, what that whole business is doing, as opposed to when it's out of sync, then the motion of the words becomes salient. What we see as now, whether the words are stationary or moving, is not necessarily what is occurring now. Those words are going around steadily the whole time. It's the best approximation of what's occurring now based on how our representational system has been designed. Back at the beginning. And here's my backup illusion because I was worried precisely about this problem. So the question here is, are you representing circles as moving now? And chances are you probably are. It's a fairly robust illusion, but because I didn't have to click over to YouTube or anything, I didn't have to push any buttons, there is no motion. This is a static image. Here, the luminance differences are combined with eye movement, which is designed to trigger the representation of motion. The visual scientists in the room could do a better job of explaining exactly how our system functions in order to present this eye movement and luminance difference as motion representation and what possible function it has. But my claim is that it has a function. There's a reason that our system is designed to represent this kind of an image as moving. A representational system needs Oh, and I'm sorry. What we represent as occurring now is an approximation of the world at the present moment. A representational system needs to know what is occurring now in order to respond in different ways depending on how things are going. Maybe everything's okay, but maybe there should be a change in plan. A system that has the capacity to adjust its actions according to its needs, to its plans, needs to keep track of what is occurring now in order to make those adjustments. An automated system does not need a representation of what's occurring now because the action is coded to automatically follow from the sensory input. So here we have the heat of the stove, and the baby is going to withdraw its hand. It doesn't need any training in advance. It's just going to happen the minute the stimulus occurs. The rigid behavioral response is designed to ensure quick action when the delay for conscious assessment threatens survival. So we see that a consideration of function differentiates this unconscious response. Here, the automatic stereotyped action is fixed to a particular stimulus condition. The baby's going to definitely withdraw its hand from the hot stove, and that's distinct from the conscious response. So here the little girl is looking at the pot. She's stepping back from the stove, so she's not having that immediate response to the heat. She's considering when the water is boiling, looking for it boiling, and she can do various things with respect to it. Maybe she'll throw in some pasta, maybe some frozen vegetables. She's got different possibilities. Her response, the controlled, flexible action, is possible in relation to her conscious representation. So we see the phenomenological structure of consciousness requires a representation of now. What it is for me to be conscious is to represent what's happening now. These are the things that are here. And flexible behavior also requires a representation of the world as it is now in order to assess progress towards goals. Function connects phenomenology with behavior, providing a means for third-person evaluation of the capacity for consciousness. We look for flexibility, because that's something that you have to have a representation of presence in order to be able to do, to respond flexibly. The hard problem becomes one of the easy problems. Of course, as those who have been diligently working on these easy problems know, none of them is so very easy. In collaboration with Victoria, I've realized how difficult it is to design a decisive test for flexibility. These are the 4 categories we've developed to connect the capacity for temporal representation with flexible action. So differential response to the environment, that's where you have a current stimulus environment, and you might do 2 different sorts of things with it. You've got your boiling water, you can throw in pasta or vegetables. Adaptation to novel situations, so here you have 2 things that have never occurred in a current environment occurring, and you have to figure out what the appropriate response is in relation to that novel situation. Manipulation of the environment to accomplish goals, and here you mess with your current environment in order to accomplish some future goal. And representation of absent objects. So here's the case where you have an absent object, perhaps a goal, perhaps at the end of a maze, and instead of simply being able to navigate rigidly, go right, go left, go right, go left, perhaps you can represent where the goal is and make a shortcut to get there in response to your representation of it as absent. Rather than review these categories in more detail, I'd like to apply the theory to the case of pain. As the previous speakers have emphasized, conscious pain differs from nociception. The trick is to articulate that difference in a scientifically tractable way. If the function of consciousness is to allow for a flexible response to current environmental conditions, we should look for cases where nociception does not trigger an automated response. As always, humans provide the benchmark case. So in the movie 127 Hours, viewers witnessed the deliberate and excruciating infliction of pain in order to satisfy the goal of survival. And we knew he was in pain because he talked about it the whole time. But what sort of behavior might demonstrate a flexible response to pain in non-human animals who can't tell us about it? One example may be the way lame boiler chickens can learn to choose the colored food with an anti-inflammatory additive and show no food preference when they are healthy. the selective administration of analgesic when injured essentially amounts to the ability to take an aspirin when you have a headache. Of course, the chicken doesn't say to itself, wow, I really need an aspirin for this bum leg. It simply learns to choose the appropriate food based on whether it's lame or healthy. Trout also demonstrate different responses to the environment when injured. Victoria talked about the way in which the trout will respond to novel objects differently. So you put a Lego tower in, it'll avoid it normally, but when it's in pain, it will treat it differently. Another experiment with trout looked at the way social behavior modifies pain response. In this case, the fish were trained to discriminate between a section of the tank charged with low-intensity shocks from a section without the shocks. And when another fish was placed on the electrified side of the tank but behind a glass barrier so the conspecific was not in the shock area, the trout would choose to be in the shock area in order to be near the other fish. A final case shows that shore crabs, learn to discriminate between alternative shelters when one shelter is associated with an electric shock. So you put the crab in the tank and you've got two shelters. It goes to this tank, you shock this tank. The next time the crab goes in, it won't go to the shock one, it'll go to the one that it hadn't been shocked at before. The question with this case is whether the behavior is a learned condition response or whether it truly demonstrates flexibility. The crab's behavior may have simply been shaped by the aversive stimuli and not constitute a selective response among alternatives. In other words, the case shows crabs can learn from nociceptive stimuli, but it doesn't yet show that the crabs can respond flexibly to it. So it's not nothing, being able to learn from your environment, as Victoria talked about. These are new studies being done on these animals that have not been done before. Figuring out that they have nociception, figuring out that they learn from previous stimuli. It moves the shore crab from what Dennett called a Darwinian creature in his Tower of Generate and Test to a Skinnerian creature. So it learns. It's not just adapting genetically. It can also adapt by learning. But it doesn't yet show that it's moved to the next level of a Popperian creature. So it doesn't yet show that it's capable of any kind of planning or goal-oriented behavior. But the crab case is troubling because the reasons it fails to demonstrate flexibility cast doubt on the decision-making processes of the more successful cases. There is clearly a continuum of increasing sophistication in behavior, which is to be expected in looking at an evolutionarily diverse array of animals. The problem is to identify which behaviors along this continuum definitively demonstrate flexibility. And this is a significant problem, and not at all an easy one. Nonetheless, it's far from the hard problem as laid out by Nagel back in 1974, where he said, "Why, indeed, we have at present no conception of what an explanation of the physical nature of a mental phenomenon would be. Without consciousness, the mind-body problem would be much less interesting. With consciousness, it seems hopeless." I've argued that given a description of consciousness in terms of function, we now do have a conception of what an explanation of consciousness would be like. It would connect the function of flexible behavior with the function of temporal representation. As a result, the solution to the explanatory gap between mind and body is no longer hopeless. It's just not really that easy. Thanks.
So we have time for several minutes of questions for Paula, and then the whole panel will come up afterwards. Oh, yes. And the rest speaker?
Why do you insist so much on the how? Because it seems to me that in some of your slides you insisted also on the ability. Sorry.
you insisted on the ability to retain the information from the past as being an important feature of consciousness, and I would tend to agree. And it seems to me also consciousness, we have some evidence for this, is delayed relative to the now. It's often quite delayed, at least by 1/3 of a second or 1/2 of a second. So it seems to me that there is evidence that it's not so much for the now, but it is for whichever pertinent information you have to retain in your working memory and use for planning, as you mentioned.
So the emphasis on the now, and the now can have some amount of span. So it's not, it's not a punctate sort of item. Representation of presence, in Husserl's term, had both the protentive anticipation aspect of it, and it had this retentive element to it, so that you were able, for example, to represent a melody as a moving, as a moving sequence instead of just individual notes. So your representation of now does have a kind of temporal span. William James also talked about it as the specious present. So it has a little bit. So that's part of what I think of as now, is not just a punctate item. Now the question of the past, how does the past figure in the now? And it can figure in terms of consciousness in that you have memory. But your memory doesn't appear, the past doesn't appear to you in memory, in consciousness. You're simply representing the knowledge that you have as something that's useful to you in the present. So, so there's a distinction, for example, in the way the past is represented as learned memory and the way it's represented in episodic memory, where you're actually re-experiencing the past in some way.
What about Google's self-driving cars, which seem to be representing what's going on in the now and the whole interaction on that basis? Does your theory predict they're conscious, or what's the key thing that they're missing?
So for artificial items, the question is genuine representation. So because I think that to have a genuine mental representation is to have this historical, teleological survival value. For the Google car, it doesn't have it. It's not alive. It doesn't have a history. Now, it's a separate question what it would be to build an item that had a genuine representation. And I think that's a really interesting question, and actually brings back the question that I mooted, which is the question of life. What is it to need to survive, and to have a need to survive that is your own, so that you're representing something for yourself as opposed to being programmed to represent. And I think that's an open question. But I don't have. But the Google car doesn't have it. I can say that. And some of the more interesting AI programs are looking at ways in which you have a more biologically salient sort of representational system.
I mean, the Google car does have a telos. It has a history. It got there precisely because designers, wanted it to perform this function of driving around and representing, and that's the wrong kind of
because it's not doing it. History. Yeah, it's not doing it for itself.
Okay. But if it evolved, it would be conscious.
If it evolved in the right kind of way, and what that is, I'm not prepared to say. I think that's an interesting question.
Sleep.
Well, what makes you think that you have the same representations of the world?
When I wake up, they're still there.
Well, then you're conscious, right? I mean, you certainly have some representations when you're unconscious. If I poke you while you're sleeping, you'll turn over. That's your sensory representation. But you're not representing that as occurring now. It is occurring, but it's not part of a representation. It's not part of what you're representing as the world as occurring now. You don't have that. And that's what it is to be conscious, is to either have that or to not have that. So when you're sleeping, there are things going on, and there are representations of the world in that you respond to sensory stimuli. but they're not incorporated into that selective conscious experience.
Yeah, there's always things happening around me of which I'm not conscious. I'm not representing the sensation at my left ankle.
Right, and that's not part of what you're representing as occurring now. So if so if I asked you to list, what's going on now, you're going to list, or so I say, you're going to list the things that are conscious. What's happening now? You won't list all the sensations that are going on that are unconscious. They won't be part of your list. They're there, but they won't be part of your list.
So sensations are conscious, as opposed to the organism which has them. Sorry. The sensations are conscious then, rather than the organism which has them.
Well, I'm not quite sure what distinction you're making there.
Well, the sensation of my left ankle was non-conscious until I became conscious of it. So where is the consciousness? Is it, I have consciousness by virtue of representing my left ankle, but it's not conscious until I'm sorry, we're getting too involved here.
No, I think you're thinking of a higher order theory of consciousness. No, right. Shall we go as a full?
Do you have a question? So thanks again to Paula. And at this point, we will invite all of the speakers up to the table for a radical experiment in having a lot of time for questions. I see Bruno had his hand up, and we'll let him have the first question.
So I think you hit on something there, and it seems to me that there's two ways of tackling this problem that people try to approach. And one of them is to try to look at intelligent behavior, which is what the pain research seems to be all about. I mean, there's no deception and everything, but it's like trying to study intelligent behavior for animals to report something intelligently, such as the feeling of pain. And the other one is to look at sleep, general anesthesia, or loss of attention. And it's those two different fields that are studying different things, which are different ways to approach, studying consciousness. And my feeling is that by studying intelligence, or intelligent behavior, or learning and memory, you could show an animal be super intelligent, do something extremely interesting, have some kind of funerary procession, dress in clothes, smoke a cigar, and you're never going to convince anybody that this is a way to understand mechanisms of consciousness. I mean, I'm not saying that that's what I believe, but that's a criticism that could be leveled, right? And then the other field, which is to try to understand what is the mechanism of general anesthesia, what is the mechanism of sleep, what is the mechanism of attention such that something gets suppressed, is another way to try to understand through the back door, unconsciousness. So what gets lost, basically, when those things happen. And those are two different approaches to the problem that are completely different and that get confused, for example, when somebody raises a question about sleep and other people talk about intelligence. And maybe that's a discussion point that we should have, that these are very different approaches to try to understand mechanisms of consciousness.
They are different, and yet they need to be able to speak to one another in order to have an adequate theory of consciousness. We need to have some sense of how these various different research paradigms connect up to be paradigms about, or explanations about, getting us at the same sort of phenomena. And I think that's one of the sort of overall challenges in consciousness research is to be thinking about those. And one of the things that I think this group does sometimes well and sometimes not so well at trying to bridge those differences in methodology.
That's true, but I mean, I think, what do you think about the I guess the accusation that, or that's the wrong word, that intelligent behavior is really not going to get us to solving this problem? So to study pain is really to study, it's a continuation of studying classical conditioning, of studying operant learning, and regardless of how interesting the problem itself is and what you discover in that field, it doesn't solve the zombie problem, you know. Whereas understanding what gets lost, so studying unconsciousness, might get you there in a kind of odd way that studying intelligence or studying conscious actions wouldn't.
Except I'm not sure how you study unconsciousness in non-human animals when you don't have any, you know, you don't have a clear paradigm of what consciousness would count, what would count as consciousness.
So
I would say that, you know, that thinking that the sleep anesthesia paradigm is the one we should go for is problematic because, you know, we don't yet have enough sense of what's going on with the animals to make that kind of a distinction for them. I think it's one of the things that's interesting for humans to make that distinction. But for non-human animals, I don't see how it would work, especially because some of them don't sleep, right?
Well, that's the thing, right? So if you could say that all animals that sleep, all animals that can be anesthetized by a similar mechanism, all animals sleep by the same mechanism, and all animals pay attention or lose or suppress attention by the same mechanism, what is that mechanism that gets lost under general anesthesia, that gets lost in sleep, that gets, you know, lost when you're paying attention to something else, that all animals have? Maybe that's what we should be studying, and that'll be maybe a more fruitful way to try to understand what consciousness is than what's actually more interesting, which is studying intelligent behavior, right? The other stuff's boring, you know, it's like, it's the non-behavior, you know? But intelligent behavior, while it's more interesting, is more problematic in a way. So that's one suggestion, one idea I have.
I think that's a point well taken, but I also think, I mean, I'm in a strange cul-de-sac in a sense because I'm working with this sort of alien on Earth. And I'm sort of constrained to think of this alien on Earth as a sort of an evolutionary experiment. That is to say, I've satisfied myself with the idea that if I can find correlates, particularly neurophysiological correlates that look like what I see in the vertebrate case, and in particular probably the mammalian case, which is the most well-characterized neurophysiologically, that I can gather those correlates and sort of muster some sort of an argument that what this animal is doing or what is happening in this animal's head, its mantle, is consistent with, you know, what I believe to be conscious processes in a vertebrate. But that's problematic, and that's very far from what you're talking about. I think the problem with intelligent behavior is it's still sort of fraught, isn't it, in a certain sense? Many people in the cephalopod community that do research on learning and memory in these animals are browbeaten. They're sort of nearly beaten to death by their colleagues when they assign this idea of intelligent behavior to this animal. People are always looking for some sort of a more parsimonious, you know, it's the Occam's razor argument. Oh, there are alternative ways around this, you know. So I believe that you're right in principle, but I believe that we have a problem because we haven't really nailed down what it is we're talking about, even in terms of intelligent behavior, especially in the periphery, you know. So, like insects and cephalopods to some extent.
Can I make a comment to Bruno? Hey. It's fine to start with the question of level of consciousness, like anesthesia and sleep, and potentially, you know, suppress the stimulus for, you know, attention. But the last one is a bit different from the first two. But what they are interested is basically quality of the conscious experience, right? Why, you know, and also what kind of mechanisms gives rise to specific experience, and why sometimes, you know, only, you know, nociception receptors are activated, but not, you know, gives rise to pain sensation. And these are the kind of you know, questions that needs to be addressed in that kind of specific, you know, sensation, not the, you know, global level of arousal. You know, that's probably, you know, in my opinion, those two are probably eventually, you know, combined in a theoretical way. Like, you know, IIT, for example, tries to explain both at the same time. And that's, you know, another approach you didn't mention, but, you know, to get to this kind of problem. But what I wanted to say was basically, you know, your approach is fine, but, you know, that will never get to the quality of experience.
Yes, in back.
Yeah,
I don't know. This idea about pain in other species, is there some issue about whether the animal or the living thing can do something in response to the pain? I'm thinking of something like clams. I like to eat steamed clams. And I wonder, well, they can't really escape or do anything, so do they feel pain if they can't escape? Or what about plants? Can plants feel pain they can't escape? Just wonder about that.
Yeah, I think they need to be able to do something because because that's precisely the question about consciousness. Why have it? Why have it? And there's so many things we can do unconsciously and do better unconsciously. So why is there consciousness at all? And so our suggestion, what Victoria and I are trying to work through, is what possible benefit could come from consciousness, and the proposal is that it comes from flexibility. So not just response, but response is the minimum. So you can do various things if you can move around, but it's a particular quality of response that you can do. So I'm not sure that it's really intelligence. I mean, it's a cognitive sophistication, certainly, but it's not, it's not particularly fancy, but it does require integration of sensation, and it requires an ability to respond. So the clam probably doesn't need consciousness, although I'm hesitant to rule things out, because before I started working with Victoria, I wouldn't have gone as low as fish in saying that fish are conscious. And Bob Elwood's work is also making me reconsider the invertebrates, and maybe Bruno's work is going to make me consider Drosophila, right? You work on? Yeah. So so I may even go to so I'm not going to rule anything out until we really work through this paradigm. But I think it really is important to have a paradigm for thinking about what consciousness is, what it does, in order to have a sense of how these different sorts of approaches to consciousness could be connected.
So for example, with the clam, you could imagine that maybe if there was something that was particularly noxious, it might stay shut for longer and before it comes back out again. And that would show some flexibility, very rudimentary, but it would be something that it could do to address the situation that it's currently in. But again, I don't know whether clams actually do that, although many of them just shoot off, so they do move.
So perhaps something else to dwell on is the notion of multimodal inputs coming in and being, well, I don't want to use the word bound, let's just say being integrated, but being integrated in a persistent way. And so integration with something persistent in memory, and I'm very liberal when I use the term memory here. In terms of memory, I could be talking about seconds. I'm not talking about minutes necessarily. I'm not talking about days. But that something holds together that's multimodal in nature from different inputs coming in, and it's persistent. And moreover, it's contextual. It's consistent multimodally bound, but it exists within a particular context, and the context is part of the memory. In a sense, that's sort of the way I think of it, and I think I have a hard time thinking about clams in this particular way, but we just don't know. I mean, we just don't know. We don't have a means of actually pinning down the question in these invertebrates. Do these different inputs coming in from multiple sensoria get integrated in the rich way that we sort of expect happens in a lot of vertebrates?
So we have a long run for one of the microphones because Olivia had her hand up next, and then over there in the plaid after that.
But it seems to me that we could be really missing out on a lot by assuming that is necessary for the most rudimentary form of consciousness. So if you're talking about adaptive function, it seems to me if you had the most simple organism, it may or may not be conscious, but if it has some damaging experience and it retracts, even if it doesn't really remember, it's more likely to live and survive. You know, if it just does that 1,000 times underwater, it's more likely to float away. You know, it doesn't have to have a memory. And I'm just a little bit surprised that the view is that it has to be so complex. I mean, maybe it is, but I sort of feel like there's no evidence out there yet that, even though it might be true in humans that there's multimodality, integration, all the rest of it, why it necessarily is so, that it couldn't be something to have a fairly transient experience that is an experience, why it has to drive the future. And it seems like that's shaping all of your work, and I'm just a little bit surprised that you open it all to the idea that you could have a sensory experience that is transient and does not have multimodal integration and does not lead to complex, intelligent behaviour afterwards, or you are all sold to the idea that it has to be extremely complex and multimodal?
So, of course, it's possible. You know, you can't logically rule it out. And that's why it's tempting to say that you could never know. You could never know, because it could be that there is a transient, you know, maybe any kind of nociception is conscious. Maybe this is conscious. How could I know? You know, it's, you know. But it seems like if we really want to try to explain what consciousness is, we need to think about what the difference is between being conscious and not being conscious. And, you know, what are the things that happen when we're not conscious? We can do all kinds of things. So we can respond in the same way that the little critters do, without being conscious. We don't need consciousness to do all those things. So it seems like consciousness is doing something else. And so if that's the case, and that is the presumption, if that's the case, what's it doing? And can that description of what consciousness is doing give us some traction so that we can make some distinctions? Otherwise, we have to either say everything's conscious, and we can go the panpsychism route, but it seems like that's sort of giving up on consciousness. At least that seems to me to be what panpsychism entails. It's sort of, okay, everything's conscious. Well, then what are we doing if we're not distinguishing between consciousness and unconsciousness?
And I'll sort of play devil's advocate, and I'll throw the old paradigmatic reflex arc at you. So what about if we went to the other extreme? What are reflex arcs? I mean, is there any possibility that anything like that would constitute consciousness? I mean, because in a sense, I mean, and I know I'm not trying to be, short here, but, once you sort of rip out, a lot of interneurons, and once you sort of dumb an experience down, essentially, and it's a really short path from reception to action, what is there? I mean, what's left? Rhetorical, I guess.
Yes, in the plaid shirt.
So I was just wondering, so all three talks seem to implicitly assume that it was all or none. You either had nociception and no conscious pain, or you had nociception plus conscious pain. And I was wondering whether, to kind of escape from getting tied on knots on this, and also in the title of Victoria's book, it's kind of saying, do fish feel pain? And the implication is that the answer is yes or no. I was wondering whether there's both in terms of Paula's theory, but also in your work on fish, whether the answer could be yes, but not in the way humans feel pain. There's some kind of middle ground there, and that could solve a lot of these problems, a lot of this back and forth.
So I think I would never say that a fish feels pain the way that a human does. It can't. Just look at the brain that I showed you. It just doesn't have that capacity. But that doesn't mean to say that it isn't aware of the experience of something hurting. And similarly, we could flip this coin and say, instead of talking about pain, we could talk about pleasure. And very few people have actually worked on whether fish feel pleasure, but I bet that capacity exists because it's got function. There's function to it. So there are. I agree with you. We've put forward a fairly simplistic case of all or nothing. I think that it comes in degrees, and I think you're quite right in saying that rather than tie ourselves on knots of saying it does it or does it not, maybe if we agree that there are different levels of it and different levels of sophistication of it, then we can start to have a fuller debate. So I think you make a really valid point.
Dave has his hand up.
I guess this is for Victoria or David. I'm interested in the relationship between the questions, do fish feel pain, and are fish conscious? I'm assuming we're understanding feeling pain as experiencing pain. So if fish experience pain, then they're conscious. But in a way, the question is which one comes first. You might take it that, for example, Victoria has made a case that fish feel pain, so therefore we've also established, as a consequence, that fish are conscious. But you might also think it goes the other way around, that fish feel pain only if they're conscious. So we somehow first have to establish that fish are conscious creatures or creatures capable of consciousness. And only then will all this pain behavior be interpretable as actually the experience of pain. If we ask the analogous question about vision, do fish see? Or do octopuses see? Well, in one sense, obviously, yes. They have eyes, they've got visual systems, and so on. But if the question is, well, do fish have visual experiences and visual consciousness, you might think, well, we first need to somehow establish that these are creatures capable of consciousness. So I suppose the question is, which comes first? And do you see the kind of work that, say, the two of you are doing on the fish and the octopus as somehow helping to make a case that these are creatures capable of consciousness?
So it's interesting that you bring up vision, because that's the very thing that drew me to octopuses in the first place. They're really striking this way, right? They have focusing eyes. They have eyes that focus at distance. They have eyes that focus close up. That implies something immediately to me that involves the notion of time and space, right? Why do I say that? I say that because if you are able to see far away and focus on a detailed scene far away, it means you can see what's interesting far away in the way of a predator or prey species. What does that mean in terms of time? That means all of a sudden your vision has bought you time. And I think that brains sort of abhor a vacuum when it comes to that kind of thing. And so in effect, I think vision is the perfect entree in the octopus to study what I would refer to as consciousness. Because I believe once you do have time and once you have a focusing eye bringing in all those submodal aspects of a visual scene, and there's a delay there's a possible delay in what you have to do to act, because that thing isn't going to eat you instantly because it's not close enough to, or that thing that you want to eat is a bit far away. What do you do with that time? So in essence, that's what drove me into this in the first place. And so I think, for me, studying the attributes of vision effectively in that sense, in an animal with a focusing eye, is directly studying the question of consciousness. The pain is something I come to later because I met these wonderful people and they started me thinking about it.